1 Samuel chapter 17, verse 28-29. I'll be reading from the New King James. Now Eliab, his oldest brother, heard when he spoke to the men, and Eliab's anger was aroused against David. And he said, "Why did you come down here? And with whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness? I know your pride and your insolence of your heart, for you have come down to see the battle." And David said, "What have I done now? Is there not a cause?"
Good evening. It is good to see each of you here this morning, or this evening. Here. We'll just go on. It's been one of those days. I want tonight's lesson to be one that is very practical in nature. Meaning, I want us to be able to apply a lot of what we study tonight into our own lives. Sometimes sermons are more historical in nature, sometimes they're more just information, but this is something that I think each of us can take and use and apply in our own lives and become better servants. And that should always be our goal, is to be better than what we have been in the past. To be better tomorrow than we were today, you have heard people say before. And so tonight I want us to look at a few situations that David found himself in. At different points in his life, David asked the question, "What have I done now?" And maybe we have each asked that question before in different contexts. Have you been a younger person and your parents come after you about something? "What did I do now?" you may think. Or a sibling, an older sibling, is tormenting you. "What did I do now?" you may say. Or perhaps we're just having a string of bad luck, it seems. And you just think to yourself, "What have I done now to deserve this?" This question, when David asked it, was rhetorical in nature, and it was in response to different afflictions that he was faced with. And so the goal of this study tonight is not to look at the question itself, but rather what prompted the asking of the question, and the stage of life in which David found himself when asking the question, because I guarantee that each of us can find ourselves in one of these stages that David found himself in. And possibly we find ourselves being faced with the same afflictions that David faced, asking the same questions. So I want to begin by addressing those who are younger. Maybe you feel younger, but let's talk about being a youth for a moment. In 1 Samuel 17, we find David coming up against Goliath. Now it is assumed that at this point in his life, David was between 18 to 20 years old. He was a young man. Teens, young people, do me a favor. Raise your hand if you are between 18 and 20. Nah, you don't know. I didn't ask how old your glasses were. I mean, we've got a good group of young people that fall within that age range of being 18 to 20. And from our reading, David ran into a bit of a problem at the battlefield. But let's work back and see what brought him to this point. In 1 Samuel 17 and in verse 13, we find that 3 of David's older brothers were in the army. They were part of Israel's fighting forces. David was at home. He wasn't old enough to fight yet. I believe the age of 21 was when a man became of fighting age in Israel. So David was not yet eligible to fight for the army, so he was at home. he was taking care of business at home. And his father, Jesse, obviously was concerned about his 3 sons that were away at battle. And so he sent David to help inquire as to their well-being, to take a care package, you might say, of food and things like that to give to his brothers. And so David delivers this package, and he's inquiring about his brothers to take back to his dad, but he's also inquiring about what's going on with the battle. And we find that when David delivers his part of the arrangement, when he delivers the package, he goes about and he's talking with people. And in chapter 17 and verse 23, he's talking with them, finding out what's going on, and then here comes Goliath, the Philistine of Gath, they call him, Goliath by name, coming out from the armies of the Philistines, and he spoke according to the same words. So David heard them. He had been told, man, we've got this guy, Goliath, that comes out and just taunts us every day, and we are just terrified of him. He is literally a giant of a man. And so David is hearing this, and now he's able to see firsthand just how big Goliath is with his own eyes. And so David, he asks the question, what shall be done for the man who kills this Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? Ooh, those are big words. You are in the camp of the army. You are not yet of fighting age yourself, and here you are, throwing down the gauntlet to the people around you, those that just professed fear at the sight of this man. And David says, what's going to be done for the man who defeats him, who's defying God's armies? Hearing this, David's oldest brother chastises him. In the reading that Jack had for us, beginning in 1 Samuel 17, verse 28, it says, why did you come down here? And with whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness? Oh, he's not very happy right now. Why did you come down here, David? Well, we know why. His father had asked him to inquire, bring his boys some food. But he says, with whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness? There's a little jab. Those few sheep. You don't have much to do. You don't have much responsibility. I know your pride and the insolence of your heart, for you have come down to see the battle. David's brother is offended at what he said, at what he insinuated. That Israel has been spineless up to this point when it comes to facing this man, Goliath. And so, to put it maybe in words that we would use, David's brother says, you little runt, you're just here to watch the battle. You have nothing to do with this. You are just a spectator. And so David replies with the question, what have I done now? What had David done up to this point? He's done what his father's asked him to do. He was inquiring as to the whereabouts of the army and what they have been going through. David had done nothing to garner this treatment, but in the eyes of his brother, David was just a kid with no business being at the battlefield. This was a place for men, for the grown-ups. David, you're just a little kid with a few sheep to look after. Why don't you just go on your way? simply being younger seemed to be cause enough for David to be treated as he was. Now, yes, there was truth in his statement, and I think that stung, especially his oldest brother. But David is dismissed because he's just a youngster that doesn't know what he's talking about. So how can youth today face that same kind of affliction? Being young. It's hard in today's society to be young. Parents, we know we don't want our kids to grow up overnight. We want to keep them little. But as time continues on, they grow, they mature. Things start to change in their lives. As they start wanting to take on more responsibility, it seems that there are those around them that want to keep them from responsibility. No experience equals no opinion. You have no room to talk. You have no opinion because you haven't experienced this that we're talking about. So we just don't want you to say anything. You're too young. And because you're too young, you wouldn't understand anyway. This is beyond your comprehension. I remember being baptized as a young man. I was 12 years old. And there was some contention within the congregation that we were associated with as to whether or not I should be made to go to the men's meetings. We didn't have elders. We had business meetings. A scourge in and of themselves. And my parents said, he is 12. He doesn't make decisions for himself yet. We are still training him. There is truth in that. But at the same time, a very wise man spoke up and said, okay, I understand that he's 12, that he may not have a lot of experience, but how is he going to get experience? So I was like a fly on the wall for the first couple years. I would sit in the business meetings and I would see how things were conducted and I would learn the processes. I would learn what not to do along with what to do. So that when my time came to be able to rationalize and think through problems, that I knew how to conduct myself. We cannot expect those of a younger generation to automatically know everything upon becoming a Christian. It doesn't work that way. But we cannot hold them back from opportunities and learning either. Because how are they going to be prepared? How are they going to have an opinion? It's by being influenced by those around them. Those who are young should not take it to heart when people look down on their youthfulness. The Apostle Paul told Timothy, he said, let no one despise your youth, but be an example to the believers. Timothy was a young man, a young evangelist. And there were many that looked down on him because he was young. He was younger than me. And he was tasked with an even greater responsibility. And there were people that weren't wanting to take him seriously because of how young he was. And Paul says, do not let that be a deterrent to you. David proved that his youthfulness was not a deterrent when he defeated Goliath. Because that young boy that only had a few sheep in the wilderness, what did he do? He was willing to go toe-to-toe with the giant. Because why? Because he was an elite physical specimen? No. Because he had experience? No. It's because he had God. I want us to look at this in 1 Samuel 17, verse 25. I want you to notice what Israel says. When David asks them about this man Goliath, or when they're telling David about Goliath, they say, "Have you seen this man who has come up? Surely he has come up to defy Israel." That's what they said. There's no mention of God. Israel valued themselves. But David valued God. Because we find in the very next verse, he says, "For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies, not of Israel, but of the living God?" Age does not matter when God is involved. Youth today should not see their age as a handicap, but rather as an opportunity. There are connections and influences that you have with people that I do not, because of our difference in age. And that should be embraced. And you should use that to God's glory. We often talk about these wonderful young people we have being the church of the future. And if time continues long enough, and everything is going as it has up to this point, that is true. They will be the church down the road. But for those that have obeyed the gospel now, they are the church now. Do you understand that? Those that have put on Christ in baptism belong to the same family as Pete and as Mike and as me. Their age does not give them a second-rate placement. They are Christians. They are brothers and they are sisters. And we should treat them just as we would treat those of our own age. Being youthful is a great time. A wonderful time to learn, to embrace, and to grow. Don't squander it because there are those that want to make you feel unimportant or want to make you feel that you don't count. The next phase of David's life, when he asked this question, could you advance that one, please? Thank you. We can find in 1 Samuel chapter 26. After David defeated Goliath, he was very, very popular among the people. They even had this little song that they would sing. Saul has slain his thousands, and David his tens of thousands. This did not sit well with Saul. Saul became envious of David's popularity, of his success. And so this envy, this jealousy, drove Saul to attempt to kill David on multiple occasions. David always chose to flee the presence of Saul, and Saul always chose to follow him. David wasn't trying to be defiant. He wasn't flaunting this newfound popularity in the face of the king. He wanted to be a humble servant. But Saul saw him as a threat. And so the threat needed to be removed. On one such occasion, Saul was camped very close to where David was hiding. I want you to turn over to 1 Samuel chapter 26. Saul was camped very close to David, but he didn't know that he was. David had done a good job of keeping himself hidden. But David wanted to show Saul that he did not intend to harm him. He wasn't out to throw Saul off the throne and take over. He wanted Saul to understand that he was there as his servant. And so David says, you know what? We're going to go down to the camp. We're going to go down to Saul's camp. I need one man to go with me to do this covert operation. And so Abishai, he volunteers. And he says, I'll go with you to the camp. And I mean, they were able to sneak right up in the camp. And Abishai, he saw an opportunity to end all this. And he actually asked David, he says, please, let me pin him to the ground. Let me take my spear and thrust it through him. I only need to do it once, and this will be over. David said, do not destroy him, for who can stretch out his hand against the Lord's anointed and be guiltless? David still had respect for the position. Respect for the position of king. And although this king was trying to kill him, he said, I am not going to stretch out my hand against the Lord's anointed. I will not do that. And so David wanted to make sure Saul knew he was there. We're not going to kill him, but what we're going to do, we're going to sneak right up on him, and we're going to take his water jug, and we're going to take his spear, and then we're going to sneak back out. Now, the way these little camps were set up was the king would be in the middle, and everyone would be camped around him in a circle, so that the king was offered optimum protection. So they had to weave and bob their way through a lot of people in order to get as close as they did. The water jug was literally at the head of Saul, where he slept. And so they took these objects and they retreated. And so Saul wakes up and he finds his stuff gone. And he is suspicious. He is wondering where everything went. I had my water jug, I had my spear. Now where is it? And so David calls out. David's on the other side of the ridge, if you will. And he calls out, I want to talk to Saul. I want to have a parley with the king. And so he is granted this request. And they start having a discussion. And in verse 18, David asked the question, why does my Lord thus pursue his servant? For what have I done? What have I done? Or what evil is in my hand? David wanted to know, why are you treating me like this? Why are you seeking my life? I have been nothing but faithful to you. To the point where just this last night, your life was literally in my hands. And I spared you. What have I done? There was no just cause for the treatment that David was receiving at the hands of Saul. Saul had no just motive. It was purely out of envy that Saul was treating David like this. How can envy affect us today? How can an envious, jealous attitude affect our relationships? Preacheritis is very, very bad. Preachers have a bad reputation of wanting to one-up each other. Wanting to be the most well-known preacher in the brotherhood. The most requested preacher in the brotherhood. We start comparing our abilities to each other. I'm better than so-and-so. Well, I'm better than that preacher over there. And this is a big problem because when we don't measure up, we try to knock the other preacher down. There's been a lot of good, solid preachers that have been waylaid because they were good. Not that they were going around being braggadocious about it, but other preachers didn't feel like they measured up. And so we have to remove the one that we think is better. Let's not work at making ourselves better. But it becomes more about the messenger than the message. Going through Acts 17 in class this morning with the Bereans. What did we learn from them? Yes, Paul preached to them, but why is it they were converted? Because they had open hearts, because they looked at the Scripture to see if the words were true, and finding out that they were, they accepted them. The power is in the gospel. It's not in the gospel preacher. Pedestals have been set, and preachers have been placed on them, to where we have a hierarchy now. It ought not be that way. But envy can ruin a preacher, and it can ruin a congregation. Because I know not everyone here is a preacher. But if I start to have this kind of an attitude towards someone else, it's going to affect my ability to serve Stoney Creek. Because that's not going to be my focus anymore. It's going to be having a better sermon than the guy up the road. And so while you may not be envious of another preacher, me being envious is going to affect your growth. And it's going to stifle your potential. Teachers. Now maybe this is hitting a little closer to home. Well, she's a better teacher than me, so I'm just not going to teach. Is that the attitude that we are to have? Or within an eldership, he's a better elder than me, so either I'm going to step down because I don't measure up to the bar he has set, or we've got to remove him from the equation. It all comes down to viewing another's efforts better than your own. We're hands comparing ourselves to feet. Remember the illustration that Paul uses of the church. It is one body. And we all have different parts, different purposes within that one body. We all can't be hands. We all can't be feet. Someone's got to be that little toe that always gets stubbed. And it takes a thick skin to be that person. But it's needed within a congregation. When we start measuring our success by the success of another, we're always going to come up short. Because the standard is always going to be moving. The Apostle Paul dealt with those who were envious of the attention he was getting over in Philippians chapter 1. Philippians chapter 1, Paul is writing this letter from a prison cell. And so he is in less than comfortable settings. But what he says, beginning in verse 15, is some indeed preach Christ, even from envy and strife, and some also from goodwill. The former, those who preach from envy and strife, they do so because of a selfish ambition, not sincerely, supposing to add affliction to my chains, but the latter out of love, knowing that I am appointed for the defense of the gospel. What then? Only that in every way, whether in pretense or in truth, Christ is preached. And in this I rejoice, yes, and will rejoice. There were those that were envious of Paul and the good work that he had done. And so what did they try to do but to dismantle some of that? To add to his afflictions. His response was not to retaliate. It was not, I have to get even. He didn't even spend a lot of time defending his own person. His response was, I'm going to keep my head down and I am going to work hard for the Lord. I'm thankful that Christ is being preached. Yeah, maybe their intent is to belittle me, but people are still hearing the gospel. It wasn't about Paul, it was about the message. David, going back to our example, always tried to make peace with Saul. He always tried to make amends with Saul, but he never stooped to Saul's level. There was another occasion where David had a chance in the caves. Saul went into the cave not knowing that David was also in there, and he cut a bit of the garment off that Saul was wearing. He was that close to Saul. But David again said, I will not raise my hand against the Lord's anointed. Those who face affliction because of envy cannot let it deter them from their work. If they do, the opposition wins. Whenever we are distracted from our purpose, the opposition wins. Whenever we stop to retaliate, the opposition wins. We need to keep our heads down and we need to keep working for God. Just as Paul said, they may be trying to hurt me. That's okay, because the gospel is still being preached. The last example I want to look at, we're double clicking, now it's working, is David had a past. David had a past. I want you to turn to 1 Samuel chapter 29. As Saul kept pursuing David, he was running out of places to hide. Saul, being the king, had a large force at his disposal. He had the knowledge of where to go. In many cases, he had the support of the locals that would say, hey, David's over here. He's hiding in those rocks over there. So David had to get somewhere that Saul could not reach him. And so he decided to flee to the land of the Philistines. That is a bold move. Just think of how desperate David was to flee to the land of the Philistines. They weren't exactly friends of Israel. And they definitely did not have a soft spot for David because of what he had done. And so David, he went down to the land of the Philistines, and of course he had God's protection while he was there. A year and a half, David lived among the Philistines, and he was conducting raids on neighboring kingdoms. While Israel and the Philistines, they shared an uneasy peace. They weren't allies, but they weren't warring right at this moment. So things between Israel and Philistia, they were okay. Saul was not about to charge into Philistia to try to capture David. So he was content to just let him be there for the time being. But the time came when the Philistines wanted to engage Israel in another war. They had been at peace for far too long, I guess. And in chapter 28 and verse 1, what we find is, now it happened in those days that the Philistines gathered their armies together for war to fight with Israel. And Achish said to David, "You assuredly know that you will go out with me to battle, you and your men." You see, this man Achish owned the land that David had been staying on during this year and a half that he was with the Philistines. And so now a war council has been called. The Philistines are going to go up against Israel. And Achish says, "You know, you're going with me." David was a mighty man of valor. He was a remarkable soldier. And the men who followed him were experienced soldiers in their own rights. David was kind of trapped between a rock and a hard place at this point. His response to Achish, he says, "Surely you know what your servants can do." That's not a yes or a no. David didn't say, "Yeah, we'll go fight Israel with you." And he didn't say, "No, I'm not going to go with you." He was like, "Well, I can see why you're asking. We're a pretty formidable force." So David passes in review. I don't know if you have seen videos, archive footage of German troops passing in review. It's a remarkable sight. Thousands of soldiers marching in step with each other, passing before their commander. The Philistines were doing the same. And as David is being brought in review with Achish and his clan, the leaders of the Philistines, they recognize that there are some Hebrews among them. We have a band of Hebrews that are actually marching with us. What is going on? They did not like David and his men being among their ranks. Now, while David had been living in their land, he hadn't raised a finger against them. He had not harmed, he had not raided any Philistine village or town. But they had not forgotten the past carnage that they had suffered at the hand of David. Look at what they say in chapter 29, beginning in verse 3. It says, "Then the princes of the Philistines said, 'What are these Hebrews doing here?' And Achish said to the princes of the Philistines, 'Is this not David, the servant of Saul, king of Israel, who has been with me these days or these years? And to this day I have found no fault in him, since he defected to me.' But the princes of the Philistines were angry with him. So the princes of the Philistines said to him, 'Make this fellow return, that he may go back to the place which you have appointed for him, and do not let him go down with us to battle, lest in the battle he become our adversary. For with what could he reconcile himself to his master, if not with the heads of these men? Is this not David, of whom they sang to one another in dances, saying, Saul has slain his thousands, and David his 10,000s? They said, we're not going to take a Hebrew with us to fight Hebrews. Because if he's wanting to get back in the good graces of his king, if they have had some kind of a falling out, then that would be a perfect opportunity for David to turn over a bunch of Philistine leaders. No, we're not going to have that happen. And in verse 8, so David said to Achish, but what have I done? But what have I done? Achish had returned and delivered the news of the Philistine leaders to David. And he asked, what have I done to deserve this? I've been living peaceably with you. You have been prospering. because of my raids. And now you tell me I can't go. Even though they were prospering, it was not enough to make them forget what David had done previously. They were judging David based on his past. Can we not be guilty of the same? Can we not be guilty of judging people because of their past actions today? Has someone ever told you, well, I'll forgive, but I won't forget? Is that true forgiveness? That's not what we find from God. When God forgives, He forgets. It is never brought up again. Honesty check now, married couples. Has there been something within your relationship that at some point maybe you've brought it up? Kind of as a, hey, remember when you did this? Right? Let's quell the argument before it starts. I'm going to bring up something from your past. God doesn't do that. When God forgets our past, it is forgotten. Forgiveness equals forgotten in God's eyes. Many former addicts, they still struggle. They still are haunted by their past decisions. And they have to work day after day after day to stay on the right path, to stay clean. And people will look at them with sideways glances because they know the history. They know the past, what this person has been guilty of. And even though they are working as hard as they can to stay as clean as they can, oh, that's not enough. We're still going to treat you as an addict. Those that respond to God's invitation, that are made into a new creature, many times are not accepted as a new creature, but are continually viewed as they used to be. The town drunk comes in, sobers up, walks down the middle of the aisle, expresses his faith in Christ. He knows the Word. We're going to just take out any stipulation that you might think of. He knows what he's supposed to do. He believes it. He accepts it. And he submits to it. Are we still going to view him as the town drunk? Or are we going to view him as a brother now? Go back up to the second point. An addict that still struggles. Alcoholism is very much an addiction. And people will still struggle with that. But are we going to look at him as an alcoholic, or are we going to look at him as a brother? People are not accepted until they meet our requirements, until they meet our conditions. Then we will accept you. God has already accepted that person when they submit to His will. Who are we to have a standard different from God's? That is why the religious world is in such a mess today. Because people want to have their own standard. They don't want to just abide by God's. Many of the Baptist persuasion will tell you it's harder to get into the Baptist church than it is to become a Christian. And many times that's true. Because they have developed their own standard, their own conditions that must be met. God has one standard. And He expects us to abide by that standard. And again, the Apostle Paul dealt with this very same thing. If you remember, after he was converted, he went to Jerusalem. And he tried to join the Christians there. Did they welcome him with open arms? No. They knew his past. This is the man that persecuted the church. This is the man that took many of our brethren off in chains and in bonds. This is the man that held the coats of the ones who stoned Stephen. You are not welcome here. And it wasn't until Philip explained what had happened. The truth in Saul's conversion. That he was no longer the persecutor of the church, but he was a member of the church. You see, when Saul got to Jerusalem, they only knew him as Saul the persecutor. They did not see him as Saul the Christian. Now, once it was explained, they welcomed him with open arms, and he worked with them for some time. Jerusalem, the church at Jerusalem realized that Paul's past actions were no longer a concern. They viewed him for what he had become, not what he had used to be. Many people have a past. Some may have a more public past than others. But we all have things in our past that if people knew about it, maybe they would look at us a little differently. That ought not to be. When we see people, how we treat them and react to them needs to be based on their current behavior, on what they're doing right now. We live in the past so much when it comes to relationships and when it comes to people, when we need to take what is right in front of us. Many people have been turned off from the church. They've been turned off from the Lord's church because the church judged them based off of their past and not off of what they are now. Can you imagine a person coming here, the town drunk, him becoming a member of the Lord's church, and we make him feel so unwelcome he never darkens the door again? That's on us, brethren. That is on us. We have rejected a soul because of what they were known for. Now, this is not to say, and I do not want you to understand or think that I am saying that repentance is not necessary. It absolutely is. We cannot accept someone that is living in sin. But when that person repents and they change and they are working to live a better life, we cannot judge them on that past sin. The two are not the same. Several times in his life, David was made to ask, "What did I do?" in response to various afflictions that he was facing. As we looked at, David did nothing to warrant this affliction, but it was brought on based upon poor judgment and poor attitudes of others. But yet David was still forced to ask, "What have I done?" We can face the same kind of treatment today. We can be looked at in contemptible ways and envious ways, looked down on because we're young, looked down on because we're older. Be made to feel that we aren't important, that we don't count. What are we going to do? I submit that we respond in the same way David did. He kept his head down. He kept his mind focused on God, and he kept his hands busy with his work. And if each of us resolve to do that ourselves, we'll be just fine. This culture is turning more and more anti-Christian, anti-religion, however you want to look at it. And we are going to be faced with many situations, I fear, in the future where we're going to sit back and say, what have I done? What did I do to deserve this kind of treatment? How are we going to respond? Are we going to retaliate? Are we going to allow them to just walk all over us, or are we going to stand for truth and stand for God? That's what David did, and that's what we must do. This lesson has been designed for those who are already a part of the body of Christ and how to better walk as Christians. But if you have not yet submitted to God's plan, you have the opportunity now to do so. This is one big family. I know I say that a lot, but it really is. When things are going right, when there's energy, when there's excitement, this is a great, big, happy family. Are there dysfunctional branches out there? Sure. Just like within any physical family. But I will speak specifically to us here at Stoney Creek. This is one big, happy family. And we want you to be a part of this family with us. More importantly, we want you to be reconciled to God. And if you have not yet put on Christ in baptism, you do not stand reconciled, but separated. Separated by your own sin, that only the blood of Christ can remove. And that blood is applied in the waters of baptism. That's the only way, friends. There's no prayer you can pray, no thought you can think that will bring Christ into you. You have to submit yourself to Him. If you are here tonight and need to do so, we stand ready and able to help you. If you are a Christian, you have fallen away, you have let sin creep back into your life to where it has affected your walk as a Christian, you would like prayers for forgiveness and for strength going forward, we would be happy to pray with you and for you to that end. Leave here tonight confident of your standing with God. Not just with your fellow man here, but how do you stand with God? Because He's the only one that really counts. And if you need to make some change tonight to bring yourself into alignment with Him, and we can help you accomplish that, won't you let us know by coming down to the front as we stand and sing?